Hi. Hi,
Thank you, Piotr.
I'm Peter. I work at a university. We have a newly established cybersecurity division that I work at. It's because cyber is this word that only the press and the government uses. They don't have what they're talking about. So we're the cybersecurity division, and I'm the CSO at Rebased, Warsaw based organises. Consultancy. If you need any help with your code, let us know. And yeah, let's start with a quick example. There is a conference class that takes name, the city, the latitude and longitude of a conference, and there's a method that says whether the name of the conference has an acronym in it. And you can say whether it's supposed to be separated or not. So rosconf will pass. This will return true for rosconf if you pass a false flag here. And there is many things wrong with this code that might not be obvious. And reek is the tool that will tell you what is wrong with this code. So going from the bottom, it will first notice that you don't do anything with a city parameter. You are performing, or in this case I am performing nil checks here, which are first a type checks, which you probably shouldn't do if the code was any good. And second, these are a bad case of type checks because they are nil checks. So probably there's an abstraction missing. Probably you're missing out a class that represents a name as conference, if there is such a thing. You can pay close attention to this dot here because it will come out later in this talk. The method takes an argument and then switches on this argument. This also means that this might not be the best design because this method probably contains two methods, and the code that calls this already knows this parameter. So the code that calls it basically says which code path this method should take, and it's a Boolean parameter, which is another kind of offense. This calls this method twice, so maybe if it's costly, this one isn't, but maybe it should be cached and computed once. And finally, this class has no comments. I won't go into discussion whether comments are a good thing or a bad thing, whether they should always be there, whether they should never be there. There are reasons to have comments sometimes. And let's go a bit further. Let's add 3 more methods. Now we have 3 methods. One computes the directions from your coordinates to the conference place, and 2 that count in 2 different ways a distance to the conference. In this case, we will notice that including a constructor, there are now 4 methods that take the latitude and longitude parameters, which means it probably is a data class. Probably you should have a parameter that basically says this is a pair of coordinates, that is a separate parameter. This code tests the existence of latitude and longitude 3 times, which probably means, again, you're missing a abstraction of a conference that has or does not have latitude and longitude. And it also has a rather hard to understand name of distance to. This is uncommunicative name. And 2 last exampple. There's a method that checks whether you are an excited bunch. It basically takes a collection of attendees, splits them into excited and indifferent ones, and checks whether the number of excited ones is larger than the number of indifferent ones. This method is what is called a utility function. It does all of its computation based on its argument. So probably it should be either moved to the object that represents the collection of attendees, or maybe the class method on conference, or it could be basically moved anywhere else without ever changing the method. So it doesn't seem to have any relation to the conference itself. Here's a bit more complicated method that checks whether you're a delighted bunch, and it checks whether you're excited or whether at least you like Vienna. And in this case, it actually refers to the conference object. But if you look closely, it actually refers to the conference object only once and does all of the other computations on the attendee collection. So this is called this is known as feature envy, and probably suggests that this method should be moved to the attendees collection, and the conference should be passed, or just the city should be passed to this method. So reek basically lets you refactor your code into something that is probably maybe better looking, and stir into your stack traces and see whether, like, what was the refactoring last week, why this stack trace looks so strange. But basically it's like Rubocop, which is a code vector, or GoFMT for Ruby, which Rubocop basically says where you have the annotation wrong. Reek does this for your architecture. So it's on one hand much more complicated, on the other hand the information that it gives you is much more opinionated and should be actually treated with much more distance, so to speak. You can plug it to your rake task, you can plug it to your CI server, and it will tell you whether your code gets better or worse. You can configure. The smells can be configured. These are a few example configurations for these are actually default configurations. So the configuration can be quite advanced. You can say that a long parameter list means that the method takes 4 arguments or more, except for constructors, which sometimes have valid reasons to take 5 parameters, but if they take 6, then they will again smell of long parameter list. And so on and so forth. You can say that too many statements. Constructors are quite often quite complicated, and refactoring constructors might not always be the best idea just for the length of the method. So we skip by default the too many statements on constructors. And you can make the excludes based, either you can write it explicitly as a class method, or you can just mention a method, or you can actually use regular expressions. This is all supported by reek, so you can configure it very tightly to your code. If you have a lot of methods that you create dynamically, then maybe this regular expression-based configuration is something that could be useful. You can also configure reek on a per method basis in your comments. You can say that I know this method smells of utility function, but it actually makes sense for it to be here, so you can just say that it smells like this and it's okay. And you can actually locally configure stuff. So you can say, I know this makes too many method calls because it calls nil on name twice, but it's okay in the case of this method. If there ever comes a third call, actually please, again, trigger this smell. So you can do this locally to your code. It probably makes more sense to have a blanket configuration and then make all of your code conform to it. But if there are cases that you need to exclude, you can do it like this. Why did I start hacking on reek? Making reek happy with my code taught me the most about OOP in the last year. Basically, reek was saying, this is a feature envy, and I was like, no, it's not. I would have to move it there to not be feature envy. Oh, actually, it makes sense. Or this is a utility function. No, I have to factor out a new object, a very small object that does one thing and does it very good and has a single responsibility. Why would I do that? So yeah, basically, this is true, but always be critical of such tools. The more advanced they are, the more questionable are the comments that they make about your code. This is a thought that I had many times over when I was working with my code base and trying to make Reek happy about this. So this is the very brief history of the project. It was started by Kevin Rutherford. As many open source projects, he was very interested at the beginning, and eventually Timo Vosna took over, and with the help of Matthias von Zeyen, they picked it up and started expanding it. I joined fairly recently because I was an early adopter of keyword arguments, so I basically went to all the tools I use and fixed them to actually work with keyword arguments, and this is like this little blip here. And on one hand, you can see that you can be a maintainer with only 28 commits. On the other hand, there is a policy that we have, we squash our commits for pull requests. So this actually means 28-ish pull requests. So you're welcome, more than welcome to try to jump into this place or even higher. The way it works internally, it analyzes your code and turns it into this representation, which basically says that there's a class constant, there's a method definition, that method takes one optional argument separated that defaults to true, and it consists of a if-else block that switches on the separated parameter, and this is the if block, this is the else block, and so forth, and so on and so forth. And like this, for example, is where reek figures out there's a nil check. Basically, if there's this kind of sequence in your code base, parsed code base, then it means there's a nil check. So it looks very lispy, but it's okay. Like, this is the right way to parse Ruby code, and it's good to embrace it rather than fight it. And the way reek actually is implemented, you don't get a lot of Lisp. If you don't like Lisp, you don't get a lot of Lispy stuff in there. Actually, a lot of it is very object-oriented way of treating this AST representation. This is how reek works internally. You're not supposed to decipher it. The reason I'm showing it is because redoing this in a readable manner would be an awesome contribution today. This is probably why this looks like it looks. This is one of my favorite quotes from David Brady. I have carefully trained myself out of the who wrote this crap reflex. Now I sure and say, yeah, sometimes in the past Yagni triumphed. There is a lot of places in the Reeks code base where Yagni triumphed very, very loudly. But again, there are good small refactorings that you can make and get a better feel of how it works. One of the things that Reek told me is that collaborations mean compromises. There are a lot of small compromises you might not necessarily like to make, but in general it's a good practice to learn to compromise on things like naming or using Cucumber, which I'm not a huge fan of, or squashing, which I'm on the fence, and Gitflow, which I personally like, but I know a lot of people that don't. I find all of those compromises to be small enough to not be a problem in practice. But again, whenever you contribute to open source project, you will have to make compromises, and the sooner you kind of get over it to some extent or accept it, the better. Although there are cases where you can't possibly compromise. Like people who spell acronyms in their class names with only the first letter capitalized. Like, this is unacceptable. So I made a proper pull request. Rick doesn't do this anymore. If you want to contribute, which I highly invite you to, there is a contributing guide. Please edit it if it doesn't work for you. There is this quote in it: don't hesitate to offer trivial fixes, spelling, better naming ideas, etc. We'll let you know if you're overdoing it. Quite often there are situations where there's a spelling mistake, but do you really want to bother the maintainers with it? Please do. We will tell you if you're overdoing this. There are projects who have exactly the opposite policy. I'm not a huge fan of those projects. That said, we do care about quality and we are a nitpicking bunch. Please, please, kind of soldier on and accept that we might feel like being overly nitpicking. It's just we try to make Reek an exemplary project, and we try always to provide a reason why we are unhappy with some minor detail. Please try to say why are you proposing this change, other than the implicit I'm proposing this change, so obviously I think it's better. Use cases where something is better are most welcome. A short, concise pull request comments are most welcome. And we do the trivial. This is a pull request that is following change that actually removes the dot at the smell of the new check that was really bothering me, that the only smell that actually has a dot at the end. And this got merged in like 15 minutes as soon as all the tests passed. This is the change. You're not supposed to read it, but this is the change, and these are the 3 tests that actually had the new check in them. We are nitpicking. This is an example from this morning where there is a code that wraps other code and turns out verbose mode, and my very gentle nitpick was that maybe we should use ensure one just in case. Probably we shouldn't, but maybe, probably there's no need to, but this is the kind of nitpicks that we do. It's okay if you ignore them, or if it's okay if you say that I don't agree with them and let's have a discussion. Like, we're super open to discussions, and the general idea is that we nitpick, but we nitpick because we make it even a little tiny bit better. We also make mistakes. I make a lot of mistakes. So I merged a pull request that was really good and it was passing, and right after I merged it, it turns out that it was passing, but it was throwing a ton of warnings. So we just fixed it in the 2 subsequent pull requests. What you can work on: implementing new smells if there is anything you feel like this Reek should do. Lazy class is a simple smell that says that this class does too little. You have to figure out what, in your experience, too little would mean, and then implement this smell. Refactor the code base. We have a Rubocop config that still has some things that would be good to iron out, some refactorings. The funny thing is Reek doesn't really pass Reek itself. Like, we have almost 100 smells in the library and almost 400 smells in the whole code base. And it was a really surprising idea to run Reek on Reek itself, so there's a lot of work that you can do there. Please do get a feel from recently closed PRs to what extent we're nitpicking and whether, in your opinion, these are well-founded nitpicks. Working on the documentation is also super welcome. It's once you get into developing Reek, you kind of want to spend a lot of your time actually developing Reek. So the documentation in parts is lacking, especially when it comes to user friendliness. So especially if you're someone who doesn't have any experience with reek, your lack of experience is actually super important, because then you can say that those dogs don't make a lot of sense. We try to create examples for smells and refactorings that get rid of the smells, so those contributions are also most welcome. And like redoing that graph into something that's actually readable, that's one of the goals that I think would be an awesome. And anything you think you can come up with. I gave a training run of this talk at our company, and it turns out there are 2 smells that people just came up by listening to the talk on their own. So any kind of your own ideas, again, most welcome. This is a quote that I like to some extent. Like the simplest refactoring that I did was, there was a method that was triggering ABC metric, which is assignment branch condition metric, and the whole read, that was the worst method. It looks short, but there was a lot of assignments, branching, and conditions, and I just refactored it into 3 methods and lowered the threshold from 18 to 16. So this kind of very simple refactorings are things that you surely can do in the afternoon, and again, we are very happy about them. These are some ideas for week 3. Fix all known bugs, make reek more Rails friendly. New smells, there are a few here described. Making actually a smell-free code base out of reek, including any smells. Again, that's questionable. If we have some smell exclusions, shouldn't they be in the default configuration? Like even if reek is smelling of some of those, like shouldn't they be turned off by default? And finally, please be patient with your experience and my experience when you come to ask me questions why something doesn't work. This is like super true, and my life shows that. And anytime I try to fix my own code, it basically seems I have so many assumptions about it that it's really hard to do. And those slides are tags.net. There's a weak link. And thanks. If you have any questions, then do we have any time to answer them now? Or
yeah, sure. Let's do a question.
Okay. Thanks. Questions?
How do you read the Ruby code? What kind of parser?
So the question is, what kind of parser? We use Marcus Prince parser and unparser libraries, which parser for parsing Ruby code into this AST representation, and unparser for turning it back into Ruby, like text representation. It seems to be working really well, although the Ruby language is one of those that change a lot and have a lot of corner cases. So I think a lot of issues with parser will actually